So good evening, everyone. I'm extremely glad. I'm extremely happy to have the honor of presenting this Mellon lecture tonight. As Alex and Michael have mentioned it's been a year now that I've arrived at VMFA, and I'm just so happy to be here. And I really take this opportunity to meet people, to make the community here understand how amazing it's been, even though it's been quite a very peculiar and particular year for everyone. I'm just so happy that I'm part of such an amazing institution and such an amazing team. So I would like, as you understand from the title, to take this opportunity of this Paul Mellon lecture to tell you about this extraordinary acquisition that we were able to make with our community support here at VMFA. So almost a year from now, and Michael has mentioned that, so in October 2021, we are going to completely redisplay this fantastic Mellon collection in entirely redesigned galleries. And this Sérusier artwork was acquired in the context of this exciting project. I want to say first that it was my intention when beginning my tenure at VMFA at the end of last year, 2019, to look with a fresh eye for the ideal candidate for an acquisition that would come to enrich the art historical narrative of this already extraordinary collection that was gifted by the Mellons to the people of Virginia. And we were able to identify and bring here from Europe, actually from Switzerland, this amazing landscape, which was painted by Paul Sérusier, a truly unique artist and a personality, personality that who I think you will find very endearing, and I hope that my lecture is gonna make you understand him and love him, I think, the way this artist deserves to be appreciated and loved. A late 19th century, early 20th century painter who also proved particularly influential in the path to modern art. And I think that's what made me think that Sérusier would probably be the best artist for us to acquire to enrich the Mellon collection. We officially made this acquisition last September, and I want to stress that very, very clearly. Of course, to enrich the narrative of the art history narrative of the Mellon collection, but very precisely and officially in honor, and this is something I really wanted to be stated in the credits of the work, in honor of Mr. and Mrs. Mellon, to reflect the spirit of their collection and their generous support to our institution over the years. This painting is entitled The Three-Pond Cottage at Le Pouldu. It dates from 1889, and I'm really thrilled to spend this moment with you discussing how formidable I think it is. In this lecture, I'll begin by presenting Sérusier's life and career in order to provide specific, and I think it's very important, specific context for the making of this precise early painting in Sérusier's career, before going back precisely to analyze it in closer detail. Sérusier, Paul Sérusier, was born in 1864 into a Parisian upper middle class family. He was educated at Lycée Condorcet, which still exists today and already at the time was quite a reputed college, where he developed a particular passion for philosophy and aesthetics, a passion that nourished his decision eventually to become an artist. In 1885, he enrolled at Académie Julian, which was a reputed, very reputed actually, private art school, very good institution for the training of young artists to produce art that would sell at the time. And we can understand the importance of that. So training the art that would sell in the 1880s, consisting mostly in academic style. And I want to stress that William Bougreau, an artist that you probably know from our collection because we own two Bougreau paintings. William Bougreau was a professor there at the end of the 1880s. So was Bramto, for instance, and I'm showing you another painting from VMFA by this master of academic painting. So you see the kind of teaching that was given at Académie Julian at the time, and other sort of training that young artists would receive at Académie Julian was at the time of Sérusier in the popular naturalist style with, peasant sceneries, moralistic styles, genre scene, scenes of which at that time a painter like Jules Bastien Lepage, of two examples shown here, was the best representative of them and the most successful. So as you understand, probably, Académie Julian was a great place to train in art, but certainly not, at the same time, clearly not the place where you would be invited at the time to question the conventions of the academic style. And indeed, when we look at the first, the earliest works known by Paul Sérusier from this period, the late 1880s, we see that Sérusier begins by being clearly influenced, inspired by this very conventional aesthetics and moralistic subjects of genre scene, including scenes of peasantry that people were very, very passionate about and would collect, bourgeois taste, basically, that people would collect after seeing it at the Paris Salon every year or every 2 years. Which makes believe that Sérusier would have grown into a traditional realist painter that would probably have met some commercial success as an artist for this bourgeois taste, like many of his fellows at Académie Julian. Sérusier's life, however, changed in the course of summer 1888. He was then vacationing with his family, like every year, in Brittany, in the region of Brittany. If you know France, and I'm showing you here a Google map of France, Brittany, and I hope you see my arrow, Brittany is this region of France where you have the tag, which is the western part of France, quite remote from Paris, where Sérusier and his family would live for most part of the year, but they would spend their vacation time in the summer in this very particular region of France. There, during his vacation time, Sérusier heard that Paul Gauguin, I'm not going to present Paul Gauguin, who was becoming at the time a big subject of attention and debate among young artists, and especially on the Paris art scene, had recently relocated in the nearby Breton town of Pont-Aven with a friend of his, and actually a person who had a great influence on him, Émile Bernard, painter Émile Bernard. You see two portraits of them dating roughly from those years, from the 1880s. And that there, the duo, Gauguin and Bernard, were experimenting to invent a new manner of painting, and especially painting landscapes, not only, but especially. A manner that would let speak the poetic subjectivity of the artist in front of what they see and aim at representing, a manner that would allow to express an immediate emotional response or subjective experience when looking at something and conceiving the means to translate it into paint. This research led to the forming of a so-called School of Pont-Aven. It's very debated whether we can really speak about a School of Pont-Aven, but definitely in Pont-Aven where people were converging and trying to create and to rethink the conventions of landscapes at the time. So sort of a school, but more precisely a movement, an artistic movement, which Gauguin himself called, and Bernard called synthetism, going back to the synthesis, finding the synthesis of the real so that it can be represented on the canvas. Being aware, and for instance, I particularly like the idea of showing you two self-portraits that they make in that context, especially when you compare them to what was the fashion before. Dating from 89 and 91, and being aware, by the way, of how revolutionary and crazy such attempts, such reflections would sound or may sound to most of their more conventional, traditional contemporaries. And I like particularly, I'm showing you this drawing by Gauguin, conserved at Musée d'Orsay, which is kind of a manifesto for synthetism, with the term written in the back. You see here, Gauguin has represented himself. He has represented Bernard in the center, and one of their friends and co-artist, Schuffnecker. And in the lower part of the drawing, Gauguin entitled the drawing Un cauchemar, so which means a nightmare. And so you have all this kind of affirmation of how revolutionary and shocking he knows that they're becoming in the eyes of the more conservative people. Synthetism, however, find its place in the general principles of symbolism, which is this kind of broad movement that at the time developed in a variety of ways in different countries of the West, Europe and America, to help artists express their subjectivity, their emotions, as well, and that's very important for the rest of the story, as well as the impact on themselves or of spirituality. So Sérusier, 1888, summer 1888, Sérusier is vacationing in nearby, and he decides to visit Pont-Aven, to say, well, Gauguin is there, maybe I have my chance to meet with the guy. And so he decides to visit Pont-Aven for a day. We know that quite precisely. We know the chronology quite precisely. And so he decides to go for the last day of his vacation time. He's on his way back to Paris. It's the end of the holiday, the vacation. And so he decides for a day to meet with these two revolutionaries, and especially with Gauguin before heading back to Paris. The result of this meeting with Gauguin is extremely well known. It consisted in a small painting, which is conserved nowadays at Musée d'Orsay, which is, an extraordinary lesson of pictorial audacity, and which was made by Sérusier directly under Gauguin's supervision. And it's a fascinating painting when we look at it in the 21st century, from the perspective of the 21st century, because we have the background and the knowledge and the understanding of, abstraction painting, of expressionism, of surrealism, of everything that comes in the 20th century. But this is 1888. Nothing like that, or almost nothing comparable, would have been taught, owned up by a young artist of the time. And so we see, this extraordinary lesson of pictorial audacity under the pretext of capturing, so this is a landscape, under the pretext of capturing a local landscape. It's a river, l'Avenne is the local river of the city of Pont-Aven. Pont-Aven means a bridge over the Avenne. So you kind of guess the river and a forest nearby, and you have it's kind of blue construction, which is a house or a church in the back. So under the pretext of capturing a local landscape, Sérusier produced this revolutionary composition. We see that it's no longer the aim at copying what the eyes sees when that determines the codes of representation. It becomes the emotion that the artist feels when facing a landscape or a subject matter of whatever form. And that leads to a daring experimentation on how to translate these emotions in colors and shapes. It's actually doing, as you can imagine, the opposite of what naturalism, of what realism, of what academism was teaching Young Sérusier in Paris during the year. And it's also, and I think it's very important also to bear that in mind, it's also doing the opposite of what at the time the revolutionaries of the day, the Impressionists, were promoting and doing. It's a complete other way of painting. What the Impressionists were preaching at the time was, to translate the result of light on the optical perception of reality. So not the emotion, like really what the eyes sees, how do I translate it into painting? And then synthetism tells you what my brain, what my mind, what my culture, what my imagination sees, I have to translate into the painting. So it's kind of it's a completely different way of thinking about the new. And you have to imagine Young Sérusier at the end of that day, catching his train back to Paris, coming back to the capital city with this little painting. It's teeny tiny panel, still wet, obviously. It's an oil painting, so it was just done a few hours ago, looking forward to telling it all to his friends and fellow students at the academy. And we know that he showed, of course, the painting to everyone at Académie Julian. A lot of them disregarded the painting, considering that, it was completely crazy and just not at all what they were interested in, while a few of his friends actually shared his excitement. And among these friends, I'm showing you here a group of them. You count Maurice Denis, Édouard Vuillard, Pierre Bonnard, Pierre-Xavier Roussel, Félix Vallotton, and Paul-Élie Rançon. So, and this group of people, this common excitement leads them to forming a group which they were to call the Nabi, using a both Hebrew and Arabic term after that term Nebim, which means prophets. So we see them calling themselves the new prophets of painting based on how impactful that painting was on them. And incidentally, that painting, they decide, it was Maurice Denis' idea, they decide to entitle it the Talisman. So they become the prophets of a new painting, and that painting becomes their talisman. That tells you Sérusier's influence and Sérusier's impact on art history, because the influence of the Nabi group proved absolutely essential. And especially around artists like Vuillard, Bonnard, and Vallotton, and especially as far as we're concerned at VMFA, I mean, in art history in general, but we're very lucky at VMFA to have this very rich collection of Vuillard and Bonnard paintings, thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Mellon. Their influence would be immense on the grounds that at the very last decade of the 19th century and two first decades and the first decade of the 20th century would be immense on the ground that defined modernism in France in this period. And it's clear that this is what makes Sérusier an unquestionably iconic artist within European art history. The Nabi group worked together for about 10 years, starting in 1888-89, before everyone began pursuing their own directions in the first decades of the 21st century. And Sérusier, of course, was one of them for the first part of that decade. But as far as it's concerned, and that's quite interesting, we know that after being very involved into the group that he had so importantly contributed founding, he left the group. He's kind of secluded himself from the group in the mid-1890s. As a result, actually, of his personal search for isolation and a clear desire to leave Paris, to just go outside of the vitality of the city and all the debates around art. Sérusier, very early in his career, just wants the peace and wants to be a hermit in France, and also to pursue the fascination that grew in him for Brittany, for that region of Brittany and its culture. So after coming back regularly in the region of Pont-Aven after 1888, in the year 89, 90, 91, and I'll come back to that period later when talking about precisely about our painting, because this is the period when our picture, when our painting is made. So after that period of the early 90s, he opted for a different part of Brittany to settle, a much less touristic part of Brittany than Pont-Aven had become, more isolated, and named Huelgoat. I was kind of looking online for old representations of this town of Huelgoat in the center of Brittany, and unfortunately I didn't find anything pleasing. So I'm showing you kind of a touristic photo of what Huelgoat looks like nowadays. It's a very charming town, right in the center of the more western part of Brittany. Here's my maps again. So you have Brittany in the west of Paris, and that part that I'm showing you is called the Finistère, so the end of the land, which is this western part of Brittany. Pont-Aven is in the south of that region, and Huelgoat is right in the center. And so Sérusier would settle there around 1894. There in Huelgoat in the city, and then in the region of Huelgoat in Châteauneuf-du-Fou, which you can see a bit south from Huelgoat, in the region anyways. And he would actually stay there for the rest of his life, making sort of going back and forth to Paris, because at some point he became a professor, an art professor, but really making Brittany his home and the center of his attention. It's a moment where his appearance would change as well. And I think I like the idea of showing you how the young guy looked like in the context of a portrait by probably one of his fellow students at Académie Julian in 87, and what he has turned into when relocating in Brittany on this wonderful portrait of him by his friend, the Nabi painter Georges Lecombe. He's known at the time, he's nicknamed at the time as the Nabi à la barbe rutilante, which means the vivid red bearded Nabi. And he would definitely take on this aspect of a mystical hermit, the way we would imagine that Merlin would look like, Merlin type figure. And from then on, his art would take a very specific direction, anchored in figuration, with a much simplified, almost naive, many would say, sense of design, rooted in this local Breton iconography, with his subjects inspired by an ongoing meditation on spirituality. Sérusier at the time converted to theosophy. As you probably know, France in this period is almost entirely Catholic, but at the time, and especially in the artistic movement, you had this esoteric, and it's actually all around Europe at the time, this esoteric philosophical movement called theosophy, which was quite popular at the time, and especially in artistic circles, and which was a syncretic approach that merged aspects of ancient paganism. And I like showing you at the same time I'm talking examples of Sérusier's production that kind of echoes his reflections around the different cultures of the world, and especially different spiritualities of the world. So anchoring, merging aspects of ancient paganism and mystical Christianity, while introducing spiritual systems from the East, from the Orient, notably Hinduism, and you here see Krishna and Vasishta, but also and especially Buddhism, and I'm showing here you this very nice homage to Odilon Redon, representing a submerged Buddha. So influenced, yes, by those spiritualities of the East, with the best information that was available in Europe at the time, of course. This harkens back to the original intention of the Nabi group, actually, which was to introduce elements of a sincere spirituality into their artistic production. At the same time, and it's actually completely connected, Sérusier develops also the idea of the immutable principles of art. He's convinced that there are permanent codes, immemorial codes, principles of art and beauty within art. And he considers that these immutable principles of art are gifts from God and that have long been forgotten by his contemporaries. And so the once revolutionary young artist that Sérusier was in 1888, when putting together his talisman, evolved over the years, and especially in the first decades of the 20th century, into a very Brittany-centered artist who tried for years to extract the principles of divine beauty from anecdotes of rural life, local rural life, and especially the theme of the Breton woman peasant is extremely strong in the later part, in the major later part of his career, who also attempted to conjugate his profound spirituality. I think you've understood that, with the deep sense of mystery inherent to Brittany's Celtic culture, and in particular by giving voice to the theme of the forest, which you can find in Brittany, and especially in Huelgoat, where he relocated, the forest and its spiritual presence and genius loci. Rooting also his evolving style into a number of references to medieval aesthetics. Of course, is looking at the immutable principles of art that he considers that painting of the day as kind of really not understand, has decided not to, prefer to forget looking for. And so his idea is that when, by looking back to very early forms of European creation, that this is where he would find those principles more vividly than in contemporary painting. So taking inspiration from medieval aesthetics, especially as you can see here, from Gothic tapestry works, as well as Italian Renaissance, and in particular the work of Botticelli, as means of capturing traces of these immutable principles of art supposedly given by God. Sérusier also kept pursuing experimentations on forms and colors, which culminated in 1921 with the publication of a treaty in 1921, which was edited and republished in the 1940s by his friend Sérusier after his friend Maurice Denis after Sérusier's death. But as early as the early 1900s, as a result of his voluntary exile from Paris, voluntary exile from Paris to paint among, I would say, among the fairies, among the elves in the forest, the fascinating, mysterious forests of Brittany in Huelgoat, Sérusier had clearly managed to isolate himself from his contemporary. And so Sérusier, after 1900, in a sense, missed a train, and voluntarily so, that was taking off. And to remain in this very secluded state of mind and artistic practice. This is kind of a sad reality if we look at it from this contemporary perspective. The sad reality of someone who had once been so influential, eventually to fall into oblivion at the time that the next generation in the early 20th century, around Derain, around Matisse, around Picasso, of course, was moving forward into new directions for modernism. The last part of his life was, in fact, quite sad. He married one of his students, Marguerite Sérusier, who was an artist in her own right. And actually, I'm happy. So you have a portrait of her made by Sérusier in the year of their wedding in 1912. She was an artist in her own right, a Nabi artist as well. And I'm happy to show you this amazing screen decorated with a landscape made before the time of their marriage. That is conserved, was acquired by Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Marguerite fell into depression in the late 1910s, just in the short time following World War I. And she showed symptoms of dementia, and she was eventually locked up in a mental hospital in 1921, while Sérusier himself fell into depression and into severe alcoholism. And he exactly in this period, and he died alone, almost alone, ruined and mostly forgotten in 1927. So a very sad ending, someone who proved so influential in his early years. The later part of his life explains why he also has been long, I think, overlooked by art history in the 20th century compared to other post-impressionist early modern artists, and especially other other Nabis that had remained Parisian, such as Bonnard and Vuillard or Vallotton. And this is perhaps, I think, ironic, because considering that he was one of the first, we can say, who followed in Gauguin's footsteps in the sense of founding his artistic career according to his own highly personal artistic impulses, rather than making art with a dominantly commercial interest or intention. What's interesting with Sérusier all along his career, whether we like it or not, whether we connect or not to his creation, is that it's exactly the type of approach to art that we think of today with a romanticized idea of the artist as a creative genius freed from society, freeing themselves from society. So a biographical survey that I'm giving you here is so that you can place him within art history, and especially so that you can understand the importance and the position of the Three-Pont Cottage, of this painting, the painting that we recently acquired, within that lifelong narrative. And to do so, to go back to kind of understand the importance and the position of that painting, we need to come back to the beginning of the story, to that summer of 1888, when in the matter of a few hours, Sérusier completed the Talisman under the guidance of his new friend and mentor, Gauguin. The impact of the Talisman on the future Nabi group, as I'm sure you've understood now, had a tendency to obscure the way art history has addressed the process of maturing, of evolution from Gauguin's synthetism to Sérusier's role as a promoter of what was to come to define the Nabi style. And therefore, a painting such as the Three-Pont Cottage illustrates very well the steps and the ambition of the young artist in definitely a more finished and determined way of what's happening in the course of the 3 years that follow Sérusier's first meeting with Gauguin at Pont-Aven in 1888 to the moment Gauguin leaves Pont-Aven in 1891, and Sérusier thinks about relocating permanently to Brittany. So the following year to the Talisman is 1889. Sérusier comes back to Brittany in the summer, kind of as like the family tradition, family use of vacationing in summer. And he comes back to Brittany also for a 2-week session in a 2-week stay in the month of October of 1889. At the time, Gauguin had decided, so summer 1889, Gauguin has decided to leave Pont-Aven to isolate himself further in a smaller village than the town of Pont-Aven itself, a smaller village called Le Pouldu, which is still exists, of course, and which is situated about 10 miles away from Pont-Aven, because he found that the artistic scene in Pont-Aven was definitely becoming overcrowded. Le Pouldu was then a very tiny little village of fishermen and harvesters, so really situated by the sea, by the Atlantic Ocean, and consisting of 15 houses and a modest inn where he took residence. And there was this tradition from a socio-economical point of view that those houses would be occupied by families, and the husband would be a fisherman going at sea, while the wife and the mother would be a harvester and take care of the land and the plants on the lands. In the summer of 1889, so Sérusier comes meet again Gauguin, this time at Le Pouldu, not in Pont-Aven, but at Le Pouldu, and he continues practicing alongside his mentor and begins developing his interest for the iconography of the peasant woman in nature, and especially this harvester woman that I was mentioning. An example, by the way, of that summer of 1889's production, I'm happy to say, is this very nice harvest scene that actually is going to be offered for auction in some weeks by Sotheby's in New York on the 19th of November 2020, if anyone is interested. It's a lovely scene. Not as great as our painting, but it's a lovely scene. Then Sérusier, so summer 1889, then Sérusier comes back in the fall, in October, for 2 weeks, in October 1889, a 2-week session of work with Gauguin, and that session is actually well documented. So that's very interesting on that regard to kind of follow that. They rent a room in the tiny local inn that I mentioned earlier in Le Pouldu, an inn that we know was managed by a lady named Marie Henri or Marie Poupée. And at some point, a third painter, Meyer de Haan, comes and joins them. And the trio and then the duo, just Gauguin and Sérusier, would paint in Le Pouldu. Marie Henri, so the innkeeper, has left a recount, testimony of their stay with her, and I would like to quote some of it and read that to you. So quote, Sérusier, Gauguin, and Meyer de Haan, or Sérusier and Gauguin, depending on the days, they would get up very early in the morning and come down from their room at around 7 a.m. After eating their breakfast, consisting in café au lait, bread and butter, they would leave and work outdoors in the countryside with their painting gear or with their sketchbook, depending on the sunlight. They would come back at 11:30 to lunch at noon. At around 1:30 or at 2, they get back to their work until 5 p.m., unless they had visitors to see, an unlikely situation. At 7 p.m., they would have supper, we would have supper. The interval between the return and the meal was filled with chatting or visiting the studio. And it's likely during one of these outdoor sessions that the duo discovered the little hamlet of Kerluron, so in the vicinity of Le Pouldu, so an even smaller location than Le Pouldu, which was itself a smaller location than Pont-Aven. So this hamlet of Kerluron, consisting just one humble farm, cottage, near the Atlantic Ocean, which was owned by another woman named Helena Marie Le Guénoux, who you see on this photo dating from a later period, with her family. And what happens is Sérusier decides to paint it. We know the place rather well. We document the place rather well thanks to photos, original photos, which were taken a few years later, around circa 1900, by a Pont-Aven painter, a secondary Pont-Aven painter of German origins, but who lived in Pont-Aven, Adolf Otto Seligmann, who would be, and we took those photos and created because he would be eventually inspired himself by the place. He's a very secondary Pont-Aven artist, but those paintings, so I'm showing you a watercolor and an oil painting by Seligmann representing the cottage of Kerluron. And of course, for us, they're not super great paintings, but they're very interesting documents to understand what we're talking about and when we talk about the Three Pond Cottage. We know also of another representation of the place, this time made circa 1892, and that's the one in the lower part of your screen, closer chronologically to our painting from a chronological point of view, again, not of the quality of the Sérusier painting, by another Pont-Aven artist of Polish origin. When I was telling you that Pont-Aven is crowded and it welcomes a lot of people, it's actually a lot of European artists who come, not only French artists, but people coming from everywhere to paint the Brittany landscapes. And so, this Polish artist, Władysław Slewinski, paints a representation as well of the cottage of Kerluron, circa 1892. And the painting, that painting is particularly interesting to us because it reveals how close the cottage is to the ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, to the sea. And that's actually very, very interesting to notice that, because that closeness to the sea is something that Sérusier apparently doesn't intend the viewer to get, to understand when he composes his painting. I'm sharing, and I'm sorry for the ugly logo on the photo, but I'm sharing an aerial view of Le Pouldu, the way it looks nowadays, of course, and especially Kerluron. The place was almost completely empty at the time. Kerluron was just the only house on the land. The hamlet, the cottage was destroyed and doesn't exist anymore, but you can really see how it coexists with the ocean. And I believe that the place where Kerluron was situated corresponds probably to that region to the left of the image, of the photo, the proper right of the photo, sorry. And I think it's very interesting to just keep in mind that idea of Sérusier not showing the ocean, like not bothering with what's kind of the elephant in the room when probably you were in this landscape, just really deciding that this was not the subject of his painting. I think it helps understanding that Sérusier, when Sérusier opts here for turning his back to the immensity of the ocean, because probably he wanted to dedicate his reflection to capturing the spirit of the land. When I speak about the ocean as the elephant in the room, that I really mean it. It's like there's the idea that I'm not gonna talk about, I'm not gonna state about what's obvious in Le Pouldu, which is the presence of the sea, and I'm gonna dedicate myself, I'm gonna keep that sea out of the frame, and I'm gonna dedicate myself to capturing the spirit of the land, because eventually that's probably what he was connecting more to from a spiritual perspective. It's clear when we see our painting that, so when we see our painting, it's when I say when we see our painting, it's better maybe that you can actually see our painting, that the Kerluron locality becomes from Sérusier an opportunity to continue its experimentation that had just started with a year before with the completion of the Talisman painting. The idea of capturing the spirit of the land and maybe even the spirituality of the locale is fascinating here. It's fascinating in the Talisman, but I think it's fascinating in the Three Pond Cottage, and probably even more in the Three Pond Cottage than in the Talisman, which is fascinating, but which in fact just remains the sketch of an idea, whereas we have here a very profoundly, carefully thought, finished composition. So as I was saying, this was done in the context of a stay in October, and in fact, which is documented. And in fact, it's very interesting. We know when we look at the painting that we are in the fall, that we are in October. And we can actually notice that from the young green wheat field, you see that field in the center of the composition, which has some traces of yellow. And you see that yellow is surrounded by this kind of very fresh green. And of course, that green is the young wheat field, which we know Breton would plant in September following the harvest of made in the summer, made in August. They would replant in September, early October. Then the wheat field would grow green. The first like young wheat field, wheat would grow green, and this is precisely what we see on the painting, waiting for the harvest to happen in the following year. So we understand in the summer of 1890. When we look at the painting, we understand we're in October. It's probably early in the morning. It probably rained the previous night, which explains the ponds and kind of the presence of the water in the foreground, especially the water on the path on the way, and the place is empty of human beings, and yet you feel a strong, I hope you do, or at least I do, feel a strong, very strong sense of presence. Through the weeds, through the ponds, a presence that connects to a whole mysterious, non-obvious but very true mythology. While the house in the distance, the big haystack in the background, the walls around the fields that convey a sense of identity that I find personally extremely moving. It all announces the future cultural and spiritual fascination of Sérusier for Brittany, for Brittany's mythology, for the spirituality of the land, which he liked so much over the course of his life, and that he developed as themes, as many themes for the rest of his career. It illustrates in particular the importance in the Celtic tradition. Brittany, as you know, is of Celtic tradition. The importance of the seasonal cycles of the land and the concept of the land as a personified being. And you see that within late 19th century France, this still can be perceived, this still can be expressed by an artist which aims at going back to the roots, to those cultural and spiritual roots. Now, so if you'll permit me to talk a bit about personal experience here, it turns out that I have spent a large part of my childhood summers vacationing in Brittany, kind of like Sérusier, but only like 1 century after. I grew up in Paris, but my family would vacation in Brittany for maybe like the 21st years of my life, because my aunt and uncle and my cousins had an estate, an estate, and I'm sharing a personal photo, family photo with you here. They had a house, and in fact, a house that was situated in the region of Huelgoat, so really like exactly where Sérusier 1 century before was living from 1894 to his death in 1927. And I'm telling you that, and I'm sharing those personal photos which were taken during my childhood or teenage years, because I feel that Sérusier's painting, when I look at it, has managed to capture in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, things and feelings that everyone can experience, that I could myself experience as a child in that specific countryside, in the specific cultural milieu of the center of Finistère, the center of Brittany, which is made of profound mystery and charming melancholy, actually. So my family's place was located, as I was saying, about 10 miles from Huelgoat, that city where he stayed, in a hamlet, which actually was named Kergadiou. And when you see that the hamlet on the painting is named Kerluron, mine was called Kergadiou. Very similar to Le Poldu and Kerluron, only at the end of the 20th century was my experience, about 30 years ago for the photos that I'm showing you. And the place, and I'm showing you other photos of the place, only 30 years ago, in the end of the 20th century, the place had been abandoned by their original rural population for like a long time already, for the rural exodus, that happened in Europe, in the West in general, in the 20th century. And so those houses, which are unquestionably the same as the one that you see on the painting, had been abandoned by their original population, leaving all these fascinating ruins of old cottages. I have to say, absolutely extraordinary for a child or children, cousins, to play around, play within, be terrified about, be excited about, build up every kind of stories around, as you can imagine, it was for me, my brother and my cousins. Definitely recalling a long forgotten and mysterious human presence, absolutely superb for promoting imagination. And so every time, as you can imagine, I look at the Three Pond Cottage, I feel transported back there, and I get reminded of a lot of personal memories. And I can share how much I connect with the emotionality of the picture. That's what it tells us about the identity and spirituality of the Breton land. Sorry, that was my 10 minutes of very personal considerations on the painting. Back to art history. From a stylistic perspective, Sérusier works at transposing the details, the elements of the landscape into patterns that would reveal a rendering of nature. The subject is for him an opportunity to reflect on the importance to painting outdoor or not painting outdoor. If it's not better actually to work indoors afterwards from a memory of a landscape rather than painting it directly, facing it in the countryside. And he actually, we know that Sérusier writes about that to his friend Maurice Denis, and I quote, "Which share must nature have in the artwork? Where shall one stop? Finally, from the material standpoint of the execution, must one work from nature or simply look at it and then remember? Too great a freedom frightens me, I, mere copyist, and yet I find so many things in my mind conjured by the sights of all the moments that nature seems to me small and trite. That it's something really interesting to, of course, read when we have the painting inside. The point is to free himself from the optical observation of the real and not copy the optical experience of nature. What an impressionist, and I'm happy to show you here one of the wonderful Monet paintings which we have from in the Mellon collection. What Monet in these years would try to do exactly in the same period, that optical captation of an optical experience. That reinterpretation of the landscape also provides an opportunity to translate the emotions into patterns, forms, and colors. And within that enterprise, it provides the opportunity to also reinterpret the Breton landscape according to various artistic influences that Sérusier would be permeable to integrate his subject matter in a broader artistic pool of references that nourish Sérusier's culture. And here it seems clear to me that the influence of Asian prints, what at the time the French called Japonism, plays a large part in this period. First, through the renewed, from a European perspective, the renewed sense of depth and perspective that probably borrows from Chinese art. And here you can see an example of a print of a landscape with this vertical layering of planes from top to bottom or bottom to top to compose the successive grounds of the landscape with a very high line of horizon on the upper part of the composition. So foreground, middle ground, background, and sky. I wonder also if Sérusier hasn't also seen, and I'm sure he did, seen this very, very famous, especially at the time, series of the 53 Hokkaido stations by Hiroshige, a Japanese printer, Hiroshige, dating from the 1830s, which was the rage in Paris at the time, and especially among the Nabi artists. And in particular, that print, Kagegawa, from that series of Hokkaido stations, where you see too much of a visual, connection. I think it's very, very possible that he got inspired at some point by this print. And incidentally, we know that Vuillard, his friend Vuillard, owned that specific print, owned a series of the Hokkaido station and that specific print in particular. So it's very likely that he could see it and enjoy it and get inspired by it. The composition of the three-point cottage could additionally have been influenced by early Renaissance painting. And here I'm thinking in particular about part of one of probably the most amazing fresco of early Italian Renaissance, that cycle called The Effects of the Good Government by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, painted for the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. And I'm really wondering if Sérusier hasn't been inspired by specifically the section representing the landscape part of that fresco. Here we see a very similar organization of the composition, only with the big difference that of the absence of human presence in Sérusier's picture, for the reason that I explained earlier of like capturing the presence of the land. In his correspondence that year, 1889, with Maurice Denis, Sérusier describes his working method. And again, I'm quoting his letter to Maurice Denis. "My drawing, especially, is transforming. As for colors, they subside thanks to a more divided way of working the tones, which enhances. I use a canvas with thicker grain and I like it better. Instead of beginning with pure color as I did before, it is better to first cover the canvas with colors mixed with a little bit of white. Pure hues take shape when one lays them on top, and this prevents dull colors, which I now notice were detrimental to the general aspect of my paintings this winter. Do not fear to use broken tones, linking pure tones together instead of uninteresting hues, make light gradations be felt. Here, Sérusier employs a limited chromatic range to translate the memory of his feelings towards nature once back in the studio, alternating strips of cold and warm hues, blue versus reddish, green versus yellow. He plays also with echoing colors throughout the surface, reds, greens, blues, yellows. And that's actually how he composes, and I think that's quite interesting, quite fascinating. That's how he composes his rendering of depth by inviting the viewer's look, to move gradually from one zone to the next, especially beginning in the foreground. The part of the reddish zones in that regard is particularly essential. You know, your gaze goes from one to the next, and by doing so, you go further in the distance of what the painting is supposed to represent. The Three-Point Cottage is a picture that we can, and it's absolutely delicious and lovely to do so, that we can compare to other important paintings made by Sérusier in that year, 1889 at Le Pouldu, like this beautiful seaweed picker, conserved nowadays in Newfields in the Museum of Art of Indianapolis. We see the common, meticulous and carefully thought sense of emotional perception of nature, and a search for harmony through the interplay of colors. The making of the Three-Point Cottage reflects the effect of Gauguin's lessons, and I think we have been clear expressing that, of Gauguin's lessons on the young Sérusier, but it also shows that Sérusier managed to get a certain intellectual independence and artistic independence from Gauguin as early as 1889, and possibly managed to influence Gauguin himself in his own way, in his own capacity. For instance, it's probable that the placing of the horizontal line on the Three-Point Cottage influenced paintings that Gauguin made the following year. And I'm thinking in particular about that painting, Landscape at Le Pouldu, which dates from the year after, from 1890, which is conserved at the National Gallery in DC. A painting, incidentally, more interesting for us that it was gifted to the National Gallery by the Mr. and Mrs. Mellon in the 1980s. So it's one of the Gauguins that was in the Mellon collection. And so I think establishing a link between our new acquisition made in their honor and in their memory with a painting that they actually owned and which we think is probably influenced by Sérusier is quite interesting. Another Gauguin from the National Gallery, which I want to share with you on that regard, also kind of illustrating the very possible influence that 1889 Sérusier painting would have had on an 1890, 1 year after painting by Gauguin, is this Haystacks in Brittany, very likely also a landscape at Le Pouldu, also conserved in DC at the National Gallery. Maurice Denis again, the painter Maurice Denis, friend of Sérusier, attests that Sérusier's relation with Gauguin was not only a question of mentorship from Gauguin on Sérusier, but actually more consisting in a common emulation, especially given the strong philosophical background of Sérusier. As I was saying, he trained with a passion for philosophy compared to Gauguin's cultural, educational background. And I quote Maurice Denis on that regard. It is obvious that his culture, so Sérusier's culture, his way of thinking philosophically far surpassed in the debates at Le Pouldu, Gauguin's level, the technical influence he would endure by adopting the master's methods, but the aesthetic of the new school, he was the one who was creating it. And that's quite very interesting to put that back in perspective when we think about that question of painting alongside Gauguin and how do we frame that notion of mentorship or of common, dual emulation of one on the other. Sérusier would then come back the following year, that year 1890, of which I'm showing you Gauguin paintings, and the two would keep on painting together in a mutual emulation of each other. And I'm showing you here, for instance, this great duo of paintings on the left, Sérusier's The Beach at Les Grands Sables at Le Pouldu, conserved at the Art Institute of Chicago, which I think is very interesting to put in regard in terms of composition, because this is not the same landscape. It's two different localities of that small countryside of Le Pouldu, but still from a compositional perspective, it's very interesting to put them together with this wonderful harvest at Le Pouldu, conserved at the Tate in London. And I am actually particularly interested by this harvest seen by Gauguin from the Tate harvest at Le Pouldu, because if you look carefully at that painting and you notice that the landline here in the back of the view of the ocean, of the bay, well, that landline seems to correspond, and we know that everything is taken at Le Pouldu, so there are not like a dozen of possibilities here, there's just one. So that landline corresponds very, very precisely to that on the painting by Sliwinski that I showed you earlier, representing the cottage at Le Pouldu, which indicates that this is almost exactly the same location. So we understand that the year following the completion of the Three-Pond Cottage by Sérusier, Gauguin comes back precisely on the land and does his own landscape about it, only taking the exact counterpoint from Sérusier 1 year ago. It's really interesting when you think about it, because we see that, so that this pile of rock is probably what you see here on the Sliwinski's painting, and you understand when you compare Gauguin's painting with Sliwinski that Gauguin paints with the Kerluron cottage, like turning his back to the Kerluron's cottage, and that makes it interesting, because then when you look at our Three-Pond Cottage, you can guess, that's my guess, that he's actually painting exactly on the field near the cottage, which you see here. That field which is green on the Three-Pond Cottage, because this is October and the wheat is only growing and being green, is only young and being green. And that's that same wheat which we see on the following summer becoming yellow at the moment of the harvesting. So I think those two paintings actually are such an exciting, such a wonderful dialogue that I really wanted to to share that with you. Obviously, that question of emulation, of taking the counterpoint, of being actually extremely respectful to each other, into telling a story that goes on and on from one year to the next, and celebrating, and as I was saying earlier, this idea that the cycles of nature is something that is deeply rooted in the local culture. Sérusier kept the Kerluron cottage in his mind during those years, as attests this rather decorative composition that he made circa 1890s. We don't have a precise date for it, where we see, which is interesting, which is the only surviving part of a screen, a decorative screen. And we see, that's interesting because here we see that Sérusier eventually opted for something like the opposite of what he did in the Three Pond Cottage, which is to associate finally the cottage with the view over the Atlantic Ocean, which he decided precisely not to do in the Three Pond Cottage, but which here you can imagine must have been like this amazing, spectacular view over the sea. Time to conclude. So I want to conclude by showing you a lesser known painting painted by Sérusier in 1906, which is a fabulous, bittersweet, this is the painting, fabulous, bittersweet tribute to this special friendship, emulation, call it what you want to call it, between Gauguin and Sérusier. Gauguin died in 1903, so you understand Gauguin leaves Pont-Aven in 91, stays in Paris for a while, and then decides to leave France for the Pacific Ocean, for like as far away as he can go from France. And then that's a whole other story of Gauguin in Polynesia. He dies in 1903 in absolute poverty and isolation. The news of his death took some time, obviously, to reach France, and especially to reach Sérusier, who was himself isolating, secluding himself in Brittany. And 3 years after his death, we don't know exactly when he heard of the news of Gauguin's death. Sérusier paints this stunning painting, Tityrus and Melibæus, or The Farewell to Gauguin, which is conserved at the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Quimper, which is a Breton city with a great collection of Pont-Aven paintings. Tityrus and Melibæus are two characters of the first bucolic, so the classic poem by Latin author Virgil, composed in the 1st century AD. Melibæus is a poor shepherd forced into exile, who meets on his way the happy and playful shepherd Tityrus. And Tityrus welcomes Melibæus in his home for the night, and the two spend the night comparing their lives and learning from each other. And in the morning, Melibæus decides to be on his way, to say goodbye and to continue his journey, his life journey. And here, Gauguin, Sérusier, so Tityrus, Gauguin is Melibæus, taking leave from his friend, and his friend, of course, and you recognize almost perfectly, this is a self-portrait of the nabbi à la barbe rutilante, the nabbi with the ginger beard, the vivid red beard. Sérusier is, of course, Tityrus here. There is something so profoundly beautiful about that melancholic homage to an old friend who had, his old friend and mentor who had just died on the other part of the world. And I think it's particularly moving when you look at the painting to see Gauguin pointing out to the ocean, kind of as explaining, I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna go to the other part of the world, and this is where I belong. While on the contrary, Sérusier is like, I'm settling on the land. I'm settling in this specific region of Brittany. And definitely here, a wonderful painting, a celebration also of the lesson once received from Gauguin to always look at poetry. This is the bucolic, this is calling Virgil and turning Virgil's poetry into an early 20th century picture. So the lesson received once from Gauguin to always look at poetry and emotion as the right channels to comprehend nature and life. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention. And I really hope that next time you come to VMFA, you have to come and see this painting, which, as we evoked earlier, is right now situated in the niche dedicated to recent acquisitions in the atrium of the museum, and which eventually is going to be a wonderful addition and part of the Mellon collection when it reopens in a year time. Thank you very much.